Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. Today I would like to take a look at one of the most magical places on earth, the Beatles' Apple Boutique. I feel like this is such a wonderful chapter of Beatles history because this boutique was so beautiful, so imaginative, and such a disaster. So today I would like to tell you about the rise and fall of the Beatles' Apple Boutique, their most beautiful and most disastrous business venture. In 1967, at the height of psychedelia, the Beatles decided to open their own retail store as part of their new Apple Corp's business venture. The concept, as Paul McCartney described it, was to create, quote, a beautiful place where beautiful people can buy beautiful things. This idealistic boutique would offer clothing, accessories, art, and assorted trappings of the hippie dream, essentially a Garden of Eden for lovers of hip clothes and all the trappings of a beautiful life. The Beatles had recently lost their manager, Brian Epstein, and were managing their own affairs with Apple Corps, pursuing creative business ideas in music, film, electronics, and retail. The Apple Boutique was their bold foray into fashion, a shop that reflected the vibrant and magical spirit of the 60s and the Beatles' own flamboyant style. John Lennon insisted that it should be cheap but good quality, intended as an accessible hippie utopia rather than a profit-driven enterprise. In practice, however, the boutique became a grand experiment in 1960s idealism, one that would spectacularly collide with reality. Chapter 1: A Beautiful Place, the Beatles' Vision for Apple Boutique. From the very start, the Beatles' Apple Boutique was envisioned as something more than an ordinary clothing store. The Beatles planned to stock it with everything they personally liked, from flashy psychedelic fashion to books, Indian tapestries, jewelry, and even home decor. In fact, the original concept was that pretty much everything in the store would be for sale, even the furniture and the art on the walls. This creative and unusual approach was summed up by John's distaste for even calling it a mere boutique, a word he vehemently vetoed, though the name stuck in popular use. The band members, especially Paul and John, had been frequenting London's trendy fashion boutiques like Granny Takes a Trip and Dandy Fashions, and were inspired by the Peacock Revolution in swinging London's menswear. Many hip boutiques of the time were started by socialites or artists on a lark. In that same vein, the Beatles approached the Apple Boutique more as a creative playground than a business. "We're not business freaks, we're artists," John snapped when practical issues arose. This guiding philosophy that art and fun should come before commerce would both define the shop's atmosphere and sow the seeds of its downfall. I honestly believe that the Beatles thought that this would work because everything they had touched in the years prior to this, every business venture, every tour, every album, was an instant hit. It had always worked out for them. They were at the height of their fame, also largely thanks to Brian Epstein, whose death marked a turning point and definitely played a role in the whole Apple Boutique disaster. You have to understand that not for a single second there ever was a business approach after the Apple Boutique. No calculations, no nothing. They just started this venture basically for fun. They were rich beyond imagination and truly felt like nothing could go wrong. Chapter 2: Dressed in Dreams, Creating the Psychedelic Shop. To bring their dream store to life, the Beatles turned to The Fool, a Dutch design collective known for fantastical psychedelic art. Introduced by George Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd, The Fool consisted of designers Simon Postuma, Marijke Koger, and Josie Leger, along with Barry Finch and others. We already recorded a full podcast episode all about the wonderful Marijke Koger, and she was such a magical and wonderful artist. And in that podcast episode, we also dive into the Apple Boutique, but a lot more into her life, her art, and why the Fool had this incredible style of art. So I'm gonna link that podcast episode for you in the description box. In late 1967, the Beatles gave The Fool a lavish budget of £100,000. That was a huge sum at the time. Their task was to design and stock the shop. They leased a Georgian townhouse on 94 Baker Street in London's Marylebone district, notably an area full of conservative businesses and far from the bohemian fashion hub of, for example, King's Road. The Fool set out about transforming this building inside and out into a psychedelic wonderland. One of the most legendary elements was the hand-painted mural that adorned the boutique's exterior. In November of 1967, the Fool's artists, with Barry Finch coordinating art students as helpers, painted a massive, multicolored psychedelic mural across the building's 3-story facade. The design was a riot of vivid colors and swirling, dreamlike imagery. A wild psychedelic dream sticking out in the drab London streets. The mural announced the Beatles' presence to the world, proclaiming that something utterly new and hip arrived on Baker Street. Indeed, at night the shop's display windows glowed with black light and day-glow paint inside. The Fool painted murals on the walls and the ceilings as well, and every corner of the Apple Boutique was meant to delight the senses. Racks of flamboyant clothing, oriental rugs and cushions, incense in the air, and sensual art everywhere. It was as much a psychedelic art installation as it was a shop. The Apple Boutique opening night was appropriately over the top. The launch party took place on December 5th of 1967, ahead of the public opening on December 7, with John Lennon and George Harrison in attendance, along with London's trendy elite. Lacking a liquor license, they served apple juice to guests in a cheeky homage to the Apple name. The invitation felt like a note from a psychedelic art film. Guests were instructed to come at 7:46, fashion show at 8:16, a hint of the playful, if not entirely practical spirit that would characterize much of the Apple Boutique venture. That night, models showed off the Fool's avant-garde designs, and members of the Fool entertained the crowd with live music on flute, drums, and finger cymbals. Celebrity friends like Cilla Black, Eric Clapton, and Kenneth Tynan mingled under the shop's flashing kaleidoscope lights. The first 50 guests to step through the door into this psychedelic wonderland received a free Apple-branded money clip as a souvenir. By all accounts, the opening was a wild, joyous scene, a raucous party to usher in what the Beatles hoped would be a new utopian chapter in consumerism. Inside, the Apple Boutique was stocked with the height of psychedelic fashion, much of it being truly one of a kind. The Fool had sourced luxurious fabrics from around the entire world, hand-loomed textiles from India and Morocco, rich velvets and brocades from Paris and London. They created imaginative, flamboyant garments, military-style jackets in eye-popping colors a la Sgt. Pepper, flowing Eastern-inspired robes and kaftans, velvet bell-bottom suits with flared sleeves, and mini-dresses with bold graphic prints. The shop carried both men and women's clothes that blurred the line between costume and couture, embracing the peacock style for fashionable young men and women. There were also exotic accessories and trinkets, beads, jewelry, tambourines, incense burners, paintings, posters, even fudge items like bespoke furniture pieces hand-painted in psychedelic motifs. The Fool spared no expense in preservation. Notably, they insisted on sewing multicolored silk labels into every garment, a touch so costly that, as manager Pete Shotton pointed out, quote, "The labels often cost more to produce than the clothes could be sold for." When Pete raised this absurdity, John shrugged it off, saying, quote, "Oh, let them do what they want. We're not business freaks. We're artists. If we don't make any money, what does it matter?" This anecdote perfectly captures the Apple Boutique approach. Creative vision trumped mundane business sense at every turn. Pete Shotton was actually somewhat of a businessman, and he was handpicked by the Beatles to be the Apple Boutique's manager. He was a loyal childhood friend of John Lennon from their school days in Liverpool, and Pete wasn't a fashion insider or retail expert. In fact, he had most recently been managing a supermarket. But that was all part of the Apple's charm. It was built on trust and not resumes. When John asked Pete to take charge of the boutique, he agreed, perhaps more out of friendship than any great passion for psychedelic fashion. Jenny Boyd, Pattie Boyd's younger sister and model in the London scene, was brought in to assist him. Together, they tried to steer a store that was less a business and more a swirling, chaotic project run by a bunch of dreamers. Pete, ever the pragmatist, would later express his frustration with how unmanageable the whole thing became. Between the unchecked spending, the rampant shoplifting, and refusal from anyone to treat it like a real business, he really early on felt like there was no way this boutique was going to survive. But at the time, he played along, doing his best to keep the boutique afloat in a sea of silks, sitars, and 60s idealism. Chapter 3: Flower Power versus City Hall, the mural controversy. Even as the Apple Boutique dazzled the hippie set, it quickly ran afoul of the straight-laced authorities. That glorious exterior mural, for all its visual impact, had been painted without the approval of the local council, or even the building's owner. Within weeks of the mural's unveiling, complaints from neighboring merchants and the Westminster City Council came pouring in. Traditional shopkeepers on Baker Street were not amused by the gigantic psychedelic artwork covering their buildings. Some likely saw it as eyesore or an unwanted magnet for crowds of counterculture youth on their tidy street. Legally, the council argued that the vivid facade might constitute an unpermitted advertisement, and the landlord, which was the Portman estate, was alarmed that the Beatles had altered the building's state without any permission. And before long, bureaucracy struck. Westminster Council issued an enforcement notice, ordering Apple to remove or paint over the mural, and the landlord pressured them to comply. Despite the Beatles' popularity, they knew there were no winning this fight. By spring of 1968, just a few months after opening, the brilliant Technicolor dreamcoat of a mural had to go. Between May 15th and 18th of 1968, workmen whitewashed the entire facade back to a plain blank white, leaving only the word Apple in cursive on the shop front as a meek identifier. This transformation from a psychedelic rainbow to minimalist white was more than just paint. It felt symbolic. Quote, "If they'd protected it and the painted wall was there now, they'd be saying, 'Wow, look at this.' But that's just typical of the narrow minds we were trying to fight against," George Harrison later said, recalling his frustration with the establishment's reaction. The Beatles had seen the mural as a joyful expression of the era's freedom, a thumb in the eye of England's plain and boring post-war conservatism. Being forced to censor it drained their enthusiasm. Quote, "Once we were told we had to get rid of the painting, the whole thing started to lose its appeal," George admitted. The whole tone of the events around the Apple shop was going sour. And indeed, after the mural came down, something in the Apple Boutique's magic died. The building exterior became a flat white box, oddly mirroring the Beatles' own creative trajectory from the kaleidoscope Sgt. Pepper in 1967 to the stark White Album of 1968. As one newspaper wryly noted, the forced change foreshadowed the end of the utopian Summer of Love vibe and the oncoming, more sober mood of the late 1960s. Inside the boutique, business was already faltering, and losing the mural felt like a bad omen. Apple had opened with such hopeful energy, only to be literally whitewashed by the establishment, a come down that wasn't lost on the Beatles. I see so many comments and people saying that they should have kept that mural and that it was so beautiful and such a big part of Apple's history and the Beatles' history, and I get it. It's so beautiful. But there really was no way for them to get away with it. And I think they might have done it without a permit because they were pretty sure they weren't going to get a permit anyway. And so I think what they did and just kind of like going with it, trying it, was a good idea. But in the end, there really was nothing they could have done about this. Chapter 4. Inside the Boutique. Idealism meets reality. Despite the Beatles' star power and ongoing Beatlemania, the Apple Boutique was never a thriving commercial success. In fact, it struggled almost from day one to actually sell things. Part of the issue was practical. Many of the fashions the Fool created were extremely expensive, bespoke, handcrafted pieces using costly materials. The price tags ended up high, which clashed with the Beatles' original intention to make the shop cheap and accessible. The band had naively given the Fool free rein, and the result was that even small items were pricey. Meanwhile, London's fashion trends shifted rapidly. Women's Wear Daily reported that by the time Apple Boutique opened its doors in late '67, the psychedelic Eastern mystical look, as they referred to it, was already on the wane among trendsetters. In other words, The Apple Boutique arrived slightly late to its own party. The chic hippie styles it purveyed were perhaps so summer of '67 that by early '68 the cutting edge was moving on toward more streamlined or back-to-basic looks. This meant some of the boutique's clothes were seen as last season's fashion almost immediately. Shoppers could find similar hippie trinkets and gear elsewhere in London, and often for cheaper. As one newspaper put it, the trinkets were of the sort people could already buy in various shops throughout London, and much of the fashion seemed to be the style that everyone had worn last summer. Worse yet, the in-store experience, while groovy, was chaotic. As mentioned earlier, neither Pete Shotton nor Jenny Boyd had run a boutique before, and the staff they hired fit the hippie vibe perhaps a little too well. One employee was half a self-styled mystic who would nap under the display counters in between tarot readings, and another was a flamboyant older woman who swam about in full gypsy attire. The atmosphere was more like a commune hangout than a business. Customers often treated Apple like a free museum, coming to gawk at the wild interior and maybe try on some outfits, but not necessarily to buy. With the rock music and the smell of marijuana wafting through the air, it became a scene where friends and beautiful people lounged and partied. Quote, "It was more of a hangout for the beautiful people," one account recalled, noting that the shop, quote, "was incredibly exclusive because it was never open. You could count on one hand the times it was open." This exaggeration speaks to Apple's erratic hours and purpose. It sometimes felt like an exclusive club or poetry den rather than a serious retail outlet. Chapter 5: Theft and Everything is Free rumors. But perhaps the most crippling problem was the rampant shoplifting and giveaway culture at the Apple Boutique. From the start, the Beatles and their inner circle approached the store with a hippie communal mentality that utterly clashed with running a profitable shop. The staff were instructed to be mellow and non-confrontational. Nobody wanted to harsh the vibe by accusing anyone of stealing. As a result, customers helped themselves basically freely to the merchandise without paying, and employees often looked the other way. Quote, "Shoplifting was rampant, as none of the staff wanted to be hard-handed with thieves, so the staff turned a blind eye," one newspaper reported. The store's layout didn't really help either. It had large, draped changing rooms and nooks that made it very easy for shoplifters to slip out with goods unnoticed. And who were some of these thieves? Ironically, they included the Beatles' own friends and even the designers. The Fool members were known to take home their favorite pieces from the racks without any payment, essentially treating the inventory as their personal closet. Likewise, pals of the band, beautiful people, in their orbit would wander in and grab an accessory or outfit, assuming, often correctly, that no one would stop them. The entire ethos of Apple Boutique was countercultural and anti-materialistic. Calling the police or chastising a patron for stealing would have felt very unhip in that scene. As John Lennon reportedly said, the idea of trying to profit aggressively was beside the point. After all, they were artists, not businessmen. This lenient attitude quickly became an open secret. Word spread among London's hippies that one could likely walk into Apple and walk out with a free outfit, no questions asked. In effect, many treated the shop as if everything was free. And it didn't help that Pamela Curson, Jim Morrison's girlfriend who ran her own boutique Themis in LA, was doing something pretty similar around the same time. She often gave away expensive clothes for free to friends, musicians, and basically everyone who stepped foot into her store. The idea of free boutiques was in the air among the countercultures, stemming from the belief that sharing was more righteous than selling. While the Apple Boutique never fully declared its all-free policy, at least not until its final day, but we'll get there, its staff permissiveness made it bleed money from every corner. In under 2 months, Pete was so frustrated that he quit. Unable to enforce any order to stem the losses. Quote, "The boutique had managed to lose the Beatles nearly £200,000 in only 7 months. That was an astonishing sum for 1967. Just to put that into perspective, that is roughly the equivalent to about £4.23 million in today's money. In 7 months. The Beatles were essentially footing the bills for everyone's freebies, a noble experiment in love and peace perhaps, but an unsustainable business model for sure. By mid-1968, Apple Boutique was spiraling. The initial excitement had faded, critics called it a folly, and the Beatles themselves were losing interest. Paul later admitted, originally the shops were intended to be something else, but they just became like all the boutiques in London. They just weren't our thingy. In truth, by the summer of 1968, the Beatles were absorbed in making their White Album and dealing with Apple Corp's many other problems. John Lennon was entangled with his new love, Yoko Ono, and his attention to the shop, which hadn't even been that strong to begin with, waned further. After Pete Shotton's departure, a new manager was installed, a no-nonsense businessman named John Lennon, not to be confused with the Sex Pistols' John Lennon. And he really tried to impose some sort of discipline. Lennon reportedly threatened to ban the Fool designers from the premise if they kept swiping merchandise or charging personal expenses to the company tab. He also discovered a couple more outrageous bills. The Fool had run up debts to Apple by freely ordering expensive fabrics and supplies beyond what the shop could ever sell. It was pretty obvious. The Apple Boutique was far beyond the point of saving. What had begun as a Technicolor dream was now limping along as a pale shadow, hemorrhaging cash. Chapter 6. Waking up from the psychedelic dream, Liquidation Day chaos. Faced with mounting losses and the realization that Apple Boutique had failed as a business, the Beatles decided to pull the plug in the summer of 1968. On July 30th, the band members, essentially acting as Apple's board, agreed that the shop would be shut down. But in typical Beatles fashion, they wouldn't go about it in the ordinary way. Rather than quietly liquidating the stock or holding a clearance sale, they opted for one last grand gesture of hippie generosity. They announced that on the final day, everything in the Apple Boutique would be given away for free to the public. This remarkable decision turned the closure into an event, part publicity stunt, part sincere altruism, part chaotic social experiment, and overall a recipe for disaster. The night of July 30th, John, Ringo, and the others sneaked into the closed shop and effectively looted their own store, with cheeky entitlement, before the masses did. Quote, "The night before, we all went in and took what we wanted. It was like robbing," John Lennon admitted with a laugh. The Beatles helped themselves to armfuls of the choicest clothes and accessories. After all, they had paid for these items in the first place. Quote, "We took everything we wanted home," John said, recalling it felt great to finally partake in the free-for-all they had unofficially been funding. Ringo remembered hauling out, quote, "loads of shirts and jackets. We cleaned a lot of the stuff out the night before the giveaway. There wasn't much guilt. In fact, the band found it fun. Quote, "It wasn't a sale, we just gave it all away, and that was the best idea," Ringo reflected, calling the giveaway the highlight of the whole Apple shop saga. He admitted the entire venture had been about dressing the world in Beatles-approved fashion. Quote, "We had wanted to open a shop and dress everyone like us, so giving the clothes away for free was the ultimate fulfillment of that naive dream." On the morning of July 31st of 1968, a large crowd had already gathered outside of 94 Baker Street, having heard the news the night prior. The Beatles had also placed ads in the papers and spread word through the media. The Apple Boutique would open its door for one final day and anyone could take an item for free. People lined up down the block. Some had queued overnight in the hopes of snagging a piece of Beatles history for nothing. When the doors opened mid-morning, chaos erupted. Albeit good-natured chaos at first. Fans and curious Londoners poured inside, grabbing at the racks. The staff stood aside. Their final task essentially was to just let everything go. But what was supposed to be one item per person as advertised quickly went the wayside. Quote, "In the end, of course, people were coming with wheelbarrows," Ringo observed, noting how some opportunists hauled off as much as they physically could. Indeed, once the frenzy began, there was no stopping it. Entire racks of clothing vanished in minutes, shelves were cleared, and even store fixtures were spared. Shouts of excitement filled the air as lucky scavengers ran off with psychedelic dresses, velvet trousers, tailored jackets, jewelry, scarves, whatever they could snatch. Some determined folks even unbolted the coat hangers, carpets, and light fittings and took those as souvenirs once the garments were gone. Within a couple of hours, the beautiful Apple Boutique was stripped utterly bare by eager souvenir hunters. From a distance, as fate would have it, the Beatles themselves were not present to witness the mayhem. On closing day, the band members stayed away, busy at Trident Studios, recording Hey Jude, while their grand experiment self-destructed in a blaze of free stuff. However, Apple staff documented the event. "We put an ad in the paper, and we filmed people coming in and grabbing everything," George Harrison noted, describing the scene downtown. Indeed, news cameras captured the scrum of ecstatic London youth pillaging the boutique's remains, a sight that landed on the evening news. Hundreds of people nearly rioted trying to get their share, and the London police were called in to keep order as the crowd surged. One report said the queue of people waiting stretched 3 blocks long down Baker Street that day. What had begun as a good-hearted idea, "let's give it all away," became a genuine public spectacle. Incredibly, no serious injuries or arrests were reported, just a lot of astonished faces and delightful fans walking off with free fashion. For the Beatles, this finale was oddly satisfying. Quote, "All the kids came and just took everything that was in the shop. That was the best thing about the whole shop. When we gave it all away," John Lennon later said, asserting that in the end, the giveaway felt like the one unequivocal success in the Apple Boutique experiment. Even the ever-prudent Paul publicly spun it as an altruistic choice. Quote, "We're giving them away rather than selling them because we wanted to give rather than sell," he stated in a press release. According to Paul, the boutique wasn't a failure so much as a trial the Beatles willingly ended since, quote, "Apple is mainly concerned with fun, not with frocks. They would focus on what they did best, music and art, and leave the rag trade behind." Chapter 7, Apple Tailoring and the End of the Apple Boutique. And so, after just 8 months, the Apple Boutique was gone. On paper, it had cost the Beatles a fortune and taught them some hard lessons about business. But true to their idealism, they preferred to remember it as a noble misadventure. Quote, "The nice thing was that we weren't too fussed when it didn't work out. It was great giving the clothes to people who showed up that day," Paul reflected, indicating that the band had no regrets about the big giveaway. In fact, the free-for-all closing event became almost mythic in Beatles lore, a symbol of the swinging 60s' glorious excess and generosity. The Apple Boutique's demise also marked in some eyes the end of the carefree psychedelic chapter of the Beatles story. As Paul wrote, "All that's happened is that we've closed our shop, which we feel we shouldn't in the first place have ever been involved in. We had to refocus. We enjoy being Beatles." In other words, the band acknowledged that running a retail store was outside their wheelhouse. But the Apple Boutique hadn't been their only fashion venture. Yes, the Beatles quickly ran a second clothing shop, Apple Tailoring, Civil and Theatric. In May of 1968, just a few months after opening the Apple Boutique, the Beatles had launched a second, more traditional menswear shop on 161 Kings Road in Chelsea. It was called Apple Tailoring, Civil and Theatric, and run in partnership with Neil Aspinall and a local tailor named John Criddle, who had previously co-founded the boutique Dandy Fashions. Unlike the Apple Boutique, which was wild, psychedelic, and managed by friends, Apple Tailoring was meant to offer made-to-measure suits and stage clothes for performers, hence the civil and theatric part of the name. It focused on custom men's tailoring and even had Beatle-esque flair. Velvet jackets, Edwardian collars, bold prints. George Harrison, in particular, took interest in this one. But much like the Apple Boutique, this venture was short-lived. It quietly closed in late 1968, with John Criddle overtaking the operation shortly before its end. The Beatles were already burned by the Apple Boutique, and Apple Tailoring had never really taken off. It faded so quickly that many fans don't even know it ever existed. It's a lesser-known footnote in the Apple Corp's history and a sign of how eager the band was, at least briefly, to extend their creative vision into fashion. The Apple Boutique building on 94 Baker Street, which once bore that fantastic mural, did not survive long either. It was reportedly demolished a few years later, around 1970, as part of area development. Today, a modern building stands there, though a heritage plaque commemorates that it once was the site of the legendary Apple Boutique. In retrospect, fans and historians view the Apple Boutique with a mix of amusement and admiration. It was a daring counterculture statement, blending music, fashion, and art in a way that prefigured today's experimental retail, but was perhaps ahead of its time. Its failure was due not just to mismanagement, but also to the intrinsic conflict between hippie ideals and capitalist reality. As one chronicler put it, Apple's staff simply wouldn't be hard-handed with thieves and found it unhip to chase profits. So in the late 1960s anti-capitalist atmosphere, the boutique was almost doomed by design. Yet what an imprint those brief months left. The Apple Boutique mural remains legendary in Beatles history. People still marvel at photos of that kaleidoscope facade and lament that it had to be painted over. The fashion created by the Fool, once laughed off as costly failures, are now prized vintage pieces. A few Apple Boutique garments occasionally surface at auctions for thousands of dollars, coveted by collectors. Culturally, the Apple Boutique story is often seen as a microcosm of the 1967 to 1968 psychedelic peak crashing into pragmatism. Quote, "The whole 60s flower power thing was about, 'Go away, you bunch of boring people,'" George Harrison said, recalling the mindset behind Apple Boutique's birth. And indeed, for a short while, the Beatles managed to turn a drab London corner into a technicolor playground of unboring, beautiful things. That it couldn't last may have been inevitable, but in its failure there was a certain triumph of principle. As chaotic as the free liquidation was, it left thousands of young people with a tangible piece of the dream, a gift from the Beatles quite literally off their own backs. John Lennon, reflecting on the crowd's make-off with Apple's treasures, felt a rush of satisfaction. Quote, "It was great. Of course Derek, one of Apple's accountants, and the others hated it," John said with a grin. Quote, "But that was the best thing about the whole shop." In the end, the Apple Boutique's legacy is exactly that image. The Beatles joyfully thumbing their nose at common sense, and the kids wheeling away free goodies in the name of love. So that is all I have for you today. That is it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I wanted to take a deep dive into the Apple Boutique for a while now because it is such a legendary and magical thing. And I think because it was so doomed and only around for 7 months, that is a huge part in what made it so legendary. But I have to say, I adore the pictures. It must have been such a magical place. And I understand the idea behind it and to just kind of like have a more open approach to running a shop. However, people really took advantage of that. And I think that that is a huge part why the hippie dream didn't work out, because the idealism only goes so far. At one point, as they said, take one in their final day. Everyone can take one thing for free. People will come and take more. And that is why a lot of the communal living and sharing can never work for the broad mass of people, because there will always be someone who won't participate. And for this to work on a global level or even on like a shop level, everyone has to participate. But yeah, I always love reading about the Apple Boutique. I love hearing all the rumors, all the stories, seeing the footage. It was such a wonderful idea, and I love that they partnered with the Fool, who made all these incredible clothes, and every now and then they go up for auction and they go for £1,000, and it just shows how rare these pieces are and what a big part of history they have become over the years. But yeah, that is it for today's video. As always, I have all of my sources linked in the pinned comment down below for you. Let me know what else you would like to see me cover in a future video. If there are any topics you're particularly interested in, I would love to know that. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls! Also, I got a haircut. My hair is so significantly shorter than what it was, but the dead ends are gone. I love it. Next Wednesday, I'll have a video for you ready of me going to the hairdresser, sharing how and why I got this haircut, and also how I healed my hair because it was incredibly bleached and damaged just a couple of years ago. But yeah, I will see you on Wednesday with that video. Bye, dolls!